the topics are the human person and core principles. That's for today. So we'll hopefully cover the first 3 topics, and then the rest in January. And in particular, when we go through point 7 point 6 on current issues, I'm hoping to talk about things like climate change and globalization and hot topics that I think Catholic social doctrine has something to say about, and hopefully inequality and things like that. But today it will be slightly more philosophical, if you will, more general, talking about the human person, which is really the core of Catholic social doctrine, as well as the basic core principles, and a little bit of historically what have the main documents been throughout the ages on Catholic social doctrine. So by means of introduction, this is super preliminary. I think it's kind of helpful to talk a little bit about sort of the polarization of American life and sort of big cultural battles and how Catholic social doctrine fits into that, and what, in my opinion, our attitude ought to be. Because we have to live with a lot of people in politics who don't have the same ideas, and it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge for Catholics as well. I'm not saying anything new to you if I tell you that the world, but the US in particular, has become increasingly polarized. This is a typical chart that social scientists will show you based on actual voting patterns in Congress, both in House and the Senate. This may not seem a lot, but this is a lot. This is a huge difference over the years. And it's also manifested in the media, in the conversations we have over dinner, over the water cooler. Things just used to be just sports, but now it's more than just sports. It's become an increasingly polarized world, but it's our world. There's no plan B. We don't have any alternative one. So we're going to have to learn how to live with this. And I think, just to put this a little bit into politics, and I know this, it's just not, the course is not going to be about this. But I think that in this world, you have a very small fraction of people who are really bona fide communists. The USSR fall notwithstanding, there's still, and you have white supremacists, people who are, really, Nazis saluting white supremacists. But those are very small minorities. But if you ask someone in the left, what do you think about the right? They'll see it something like this. It's all just a whole bunch of white supremacists. That's really what everyone is. And of course, I have to say that if you ask a lot of conservatives what they think about, sort of, for example, the Democratic Party, just a bunch of communists. And it's not quite true. And I think that part of the idea of polarization is that our view of the others very easily becomes very stylized, caricature-based, extremist. And so I would say that as a first step, I know it's not easy, but I think it's kind of helpful as we go through Catholic social doctrine to try and think of, things in a not radical way, and not avoid the knee-jerk reaction that we frequently have whenever certain keywords are brought to bear, like solidarity, inequality, and other ones that will come out, which can frequently provoke certain reactions. And so, like I said, primarily in the US. And the 3 principles, we find this polarization. The 3 principles that I think are kind of helpful and healthy. We already know this, and our Father, in fact, taught us a lot about that. Be very tolerant with people, but not with error. Okay, I got that. That's easy. Look for the common denominator, which is perfectly consistent with a very diverse numerator. In fact, our Father told us about politics within the Word. There's no political school of thought in Opus Dei, or theological school of thought for that matter. We have a common denominator of our spirit, and as Catholics, of our faith, of course. But then there's a vast variety of numerator, which in fact is a good thing, and we should celebrate that and learn how to live with that. Then there's a 3rd principle that it's not frequently mentioned, but if you read the Father's letters, our Father's letters that were recently republished, he actually brings that up, which is also important. Frequently, some ideas which are erroneous, let's get it right, but they do have elements of truth. And I think it's part of what we should be doing is try to get as much as possible from that common ground, from that good stuff, good ideas that we find even in people who otherwise have very erroneous ideas, without compromising principles, Yeah, that's the first principle. But nevertheless, try to do it as much as possible. Yes, Rob.
So it says tolerance with people, not with terror.
Error. That's a typo. Sorry. But actually, now they mentioned it, we should also be intolerant with terror. See, there you go. It's a happy typo in a way. Apologies, I have to say that this is all new to me. I very recently prepared these slides, and so thanks for mentioning that. So some illustrations of these principles. First, it's one of many quotes that our father had on this. A disciple of Christ will never treat anyone badly. So we know that, and sometimes it's difficult, but we want to stick to that. Always treat people with kindness, not necessarily agree with them. And our father gave us a great example of that. Second one, I really like this quote. So James Joyce in Finnegan's Wake, he refers to the Catholic Church with the derogatory remark, "Here comes everyone." I actually think it's not a derogatory remark. It's actually one of the best things you could say about the Catholic Church. And so the third point, this is, I wrote some time ago an article on that. I think it's a great church that can have, at the same time, in the same city, by the way, people as diverse as Dorothy Day and Bill Buckley. Great. Couldn't have a more diverse numerator in there, I tell you. And so I think this actually has something to be celebrated. And finally, this is a quote from one of the father's letters, Vosaltem, which I think is very interesting. And it's precisely that point that I want to mention. Very frequently, you'll find that people who otherwise are completely off the charts in being completely wrong, but their ideas, I mean, half of America, they cannot be evil. That's just not possible. And then it cannot be completely wrong. I mean, there's got to have some, I mean, they're smart people. There are a lot of very intelligent people. It's got to be a reason why you would be pro-choice and not understand pro-life principles. It's not because they're stupid. I don't think so, because a lot of people are super smart. It's not because they're evil. Maybe a few people are, I suppose, but not half of America. I mean, that's just too many people. And plus, I mean, they have some interesting ideas, some good, and it's important to try to get as much as possible as you can from that. So this by means of a preliminary introduction to, as we go through Catholic social doctrine, because my experience is that it frequently provokes a certain level of sort of knee-jerk reaction to some of these topics. So the other question, preliminary question, is why? Why should there be Catholic social teaching? I mean, there's Catholic teaching, there's Catholic doctrine, there are dogmas, and then all of that. Why should the church get into politics, to put it sort of very, very blatantly? First thing that I would say is that it's not a doctrine just for Catholics. And there's an old joke, or maybe you don't know this joke, that there are these two hippies in Berkeley, and they come across a Catholic priest who has a cast. Broken arm. So, hey, bro, how's it go, bro? What happened, bro? And the priest says, well, I slipped in the shower. Well, bro, peace, this and that. And then they continue on. And then one of the hippies asks the other one, what's that thing of a shower? I don't know. I'm not Catholic. So I'm not Catholic. I don't know what a shower is, which is certainly true for those hippies. But some people, and this happens a lot, I'm not interested in Catholic, so I'm not Catholic, so this doesn't interest me. No, actually, Catholic social doctrine, I mean, it is about humanity, so it should interest and should be applicable to every member of the human species. So this is not just something for us, it's something for the world. Now, a related question we ask is, why is Catholic social teaching called Catholic? If it's for everyone, why do you call it Catholic? That's an interesting question. And I personally think that the term Catholic social teaching or Catholic social doctrine is a bit of a misnomer, because there's nothing specifically Catholic about it. It's really about humanity. And so the related question you might ask is, what is the authority? With what authority are you saying this? In particular, when you're going to say to some people who are not Catholics. And I really like the Paul VI address to the United Nations, where he used that expression of the church as being expert in humanity. It's the idea, listen, we've been around for a while, number one, 1,000 years. And by revelation and by experience, we know a lot about the anthropology of human beings, and which is really what this is all about. And so that is the source of authority. Now, having said that, we're talking about humanity. We're not talking about dogmas of Catholic faith. And so that's the idea. To put it even deeper, if you want, in the words of John Paul II in the inaugural address in 1978, is Christ knows man, what is in man. And so it's the idea that that's the source of the expertise that the church has in humanity. And that's really the reason why, A, we're interested in it, B, why it's applicable not only to Catholics, but to everyone. And that's also the reason why, in the encyclicals, you'll see the heading of the encyclical, to the bishops, to this, to that, and to all men of goodwill. But it's not, a lot of what's written in here is not necessarily for the exclusive views of Catholics. That's quite broad. So I think that's also how we should think about Catholic social teaching. Now, this part on central insight, I mean, it could spend 2 hours in it, or I can spend one slide. So I'm going to spend just one slide and kind of summarizing. If I had to summarize, perhaps the best quote is from Gaudium et Spes. Man is the source, the focus, and the aim of all economic life. So if I had to choose one sentence, I probably choose this one. It's all about man. It's not about growth. It's not about efficiency. It's not about democracy per se. It's not about, no, it's the centrality of man. And why? Because we are created in the image of God. So that's, you may not believe in God or not, but I mean, that's just the truth. And that is the source of the inherent dignity of all human beings. That's really, I mean, if I had to summarize everything in one slide, that would be this. Now, as we go and talk then about, how to relate that to other people, even people who don't believe in God, we have to somehow explain human dignity in a way that hopefully they'll understand. For us, it's a lot easier. Listen, if you're creating God's image and likeness, whoa, I mean, it's such a extraordinary statement that should never get used to the idea, which is really a deep curve idea of being divinized and all that, but that's different. But from a practical point of view, in terms of Catholic social doctrine, what that means is this dignity of every human being. Not because of what we do, not because you're more intelligent or less intelligent, not because you're more productive or less productive, not because you have full use of all of your faculties or not, because you're a human being and you were created in God's image and likeness. If you don't believe in God, we have to come to some sort of understanding about human dignity. And fortunately, we have done, in my opinion, we've done actually, considerable progress in being able to exchange ideas with non-believers, even though, as I said, the source of this is the transcendental element and the fact that we're created in God's image and likeness. So if I had to summarize everything in one slide, it would be this. In practice, it's a lot more things. But again, I'll be doing this as we go along. I think it's very important because we live in a world where a lot of people, and increasingly so, are nuns, meaning no denomination. They're non-believers, they're agnostics or atheists, to try and find a common ground, because otherwise, this becomes the doctrine for Catholics. Oh, I'm not Catholic, I'm not interested in that, which it's the worst thing that can happen. It's like when I have a debate on abortion, the first thing that we have to agree is that this is not about religion. In my opinion, that's the number one step you have to take when you talk about any matter related to. This is not about religion, because the moment it's about religion, it's say, well, okay, you got your truth, I got mine. And no, that's not. So we have to try and explain Catholic social doctrine to people who are not Catholics. To explain this is not something just for the use and consumption of Catholics. And I know that, Andrew Young may be one of these people who can provoke knee-jerk reactions, but I think it's an example, if he wants to have his campaign on human-centered capitalism, okay, let's talk about that. That's an interesting principle. In fact, I think it's very consistent with Catholic social doctrine, maybe for a different reason. Maybe he doesn't even know why he thinks that human-centered capitalism is a good idea. But, sometimes even if you don't have the right philosophical foundations, we have a common ground and we talk about things. So I think this is kind of an attitude that is important to have. Okay, so that said, what I'm going to do now is go through a series. By the way, you can have, I'm happy to share all of these slides with you, the slide deck with you. Just go through, this is my own selection, series of documents that I think are particularly important. Most of these are encyclicals, but not exclusively. Some of these are radio messages or apostolic letters. And what's the difference between those things? Well, a radio message is a radio address, of course, but an apostolic letter, it's probably a slightly lower level of importance, but I'm giving you the documents that, in my opinion, are perhaps or have been most influential in Catholic social doctrine. So it all starts in 1891, Leo XIII. And by the way, all of these, as we'll see, they are a reaction of the church's teaching to events in the world. Because, I mean, the church is in the world. We are human beings. We are in this planet, in this society, and therefore, over the years, the list of problems are different. And in terms of the economic history of the world, the biggest event that ever happened, I mean, in terms of history was incarnation, but in terms of economic history was the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's sort of like day and night. And I know that it's very fashionable nowadays to complain about capitalism and all the evils of capitalism. Usually what I tell those people is, listen, here's what you're going to do. Get on a time machine as soon as you can, put yourself back in the 17th century. I can guarantee that in less than 24 hours, you'll be begging to come back to 2022. Okay, Chris. Can you explain that? Yeah, I was going to go through this very briefly. We don't have a lot of time, but so Rerum Novarum is reacting to the excesses of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it is sort of it truly is a revolution, but it's a period where, in particular, work conditions were, I mean, there were 100-hour weeks. I know not exactly, and this is not investment banking. This is people in factories full of smoke and I mean, it was really subhuman conditions. Quadragesimo anno. This is already, after the Bolshevik Revolution and so forth, and the rising of National Socialism. This is a new experience. We see, well, maybe not completely new, but important in the moment, of totalitarian regimes. Pius XII. This is again is the beginning of a phase in Catholic social doctrine, which is very much related to world peace and world equity and justice. This happens primarily in the next phase when John XXIII and Paul VI arrive in the scene. So those are some of the important initial documents. I mean, there's a lot more than I have in here. Then we have this middle period in my list in here, which, like I said, it's John XXIII and Paul VI. This is a period, it's primarily the post-war, where Europe and the world is growing very fast, is recovering from the war. And when globalization is achieving its third stage, this is no longer discoveries, this is no longer just shipping stuff from place to place. This is the multinationals expanding, this is foreign direct investment. There's a lot going on during the middle of the 20th century. And so different issues, different sets of issues appear. It's Cold War as well. So these encyclicals are very much related to that thing, the international community. United Nations is created, the Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. This is the period that we're talking about in here. So as you can see, I mean, the papal teachings do reflect, do go along with the problems of the times. Of course, there's a lot more happening in terms of papal teachings in this period. I'm just referring to ones that are more closely related to a Catholic, to social thought. Nuclear war, poverty, disarmament, and so forth. And then we enter Saint John Paul the Great. I have like 3 slides in here, and I tried to summarize the best that I could. I think if I had to select one pope who sort of stands out, of course, Leo XIII, because he was the first one. I mean, in a way, he gets kind of special credit for that. But St. John Paul the Great, I mean, he wrote and rewrote enormous amounts of text. People talk about all his travels, which were, of course, many, but his writings on social thought, I think they're unrivaled by any other pope before or after him. He really, I'm not going to say rewrote it, not that he did or wrote anything different from what was before, but the depth and the extent of the Pope's, John Paul II's writings is just enormous. It starts with Redemptor Hominis, which kind of really deepens into the idea of personalism. So the principle that I mentioned of the dignity of the human person, why and how, what does that mean? So the doctrine of personalism starts in there. Then in 1981, Laborem Exercens, as if we did not already have enough encyclicals on work and labor, but he really nails it. In particular, this concept that work, human work, is not just the objective element of it, it's also the subjective element, which is very important. And in fact, this is also very closely related to the spirit of the work, that we don't just sanctify the work, we also sanctify ourselves with the work. I mean, there's both an objective and a subjective element to it, which is very important. And then, of course, in the 1980s, his work with regards to totalitarian regimes, but in particular the Soviet Union, and I'm not going to have much time in here to explain exactly the different steps that the world turned in the 1980s, but certainly John Paul II was an important player, and I'm sure he could tell us something about that. Tony could tell us something about that. But we also see that reflected in his encyclicals, for example, in the Sollicitudo Res Socialis of 1987. Now, frequently quoted in a selective manner, yes, the Pope, very much fighting communism and communist regimes and so forth, was very important. But equally, his condemnation of unbridled capitalism, you also find it very much in Sollicitudo Res Socialis and in other documents. And then another important one on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, 1991, it's basically reaffirming that. But once again, hitting on both sides. It's not like now all of a sudden the church is right wing or now the church is left wing. No, the church doesn't have a wing. The church is centered on Christ and on the person. That's really what it is. Now, if you want to say that's right or left, I don't know. And in a way, I don't care. Okay, that's one way of reading a Centesimus on it. I'm just going to finish this list of encyclicals and we take a break. We are a little behind schedule, but it's good because at least normally when I read this stuff, I fall asleep. So at least I kept you awake. So that's kind of good. Still with the JP2, so Evangelii Vitae is very important for many reasons, but also, I mean, this is also an important part of Catholic social doctrine and all the implications of protecting human beings, especially the innocent ones, and anyway, we know all this. And finally, I'm still having here two encyclicals from the two most recent popes. So Caritas et Veritate talks all about the common good, something we'll talk a little more about later on, and the relation between government and the market, the whole issue of subsidiarity I'll talk about later, which goes back to Pius XI. And Francis, I think perhaps from a point of view of Catholic social doctrine, Laudato Si is very important. I know this is very controversial. This is one of the knee-jerk reaction kind of things. Ecology and climate, because we so frequently associate with far left progressive extremist policies. There's some of that, but again, go back to one of my principles. Rarely there are ideas out there that are completely bad. They frequently have something good in it, and we have to know how to distinguish one element from the other. My last slide before the break polarization, unfortunately, in my opinion, unfortunately, sometimes also takes place within the church, in particular in the US. I've noticed that quite a bit. And I think when it comes to Catholic social thought, if you read the documents carefully, it's really the same thing. In fact, if anything, you might say that they're repeating each other too much. There's actually, from Leo XIII all the way to Francis, that really is a continuity of basic principles of Catholic social thought. Now, having said that, different popes have different fights, have different backgrounds. One grew up under the Soviet Union dominance. The other one grew up on the other side of the fence in Germany. Another one grew up in Latin America. The types of issues, the type of realities you're exposed to is very different. They face different realities and they took different fights. My summary of the past three popes is John Paul II, communism and totalitarian regimes of Eastern Europe. Benedict, the dictatorship of relativism. And Francis, global indifference. And as I will explain later on, they all relate to core principles of Catholic social thought. They're different fights. They focus on different areas, but it's really the same thing and different styles. And in fact, I will illustrate that how Benedict and Francis may be saying the same thing in very different ways. Boy, very different ways. And as someone said, you don't have to like the Pope. You have to love the Pope and the office. Some popes might have a style that is not your style, but just try to filter that and go to the core principles. And those have been always the same. They really, there's a remarkable consistency of the basic principles, even though, like I said, the way of expressing them may change a little bit. Okay, I think perhaps we can make a stop here and stop for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Is 5 okay? Because we're slightly behind schedule. So far, all I've done was point 1, which is sort of introduction. So we're going a little slow. So the two other things that we have to do before 1 p.m. are to talk about the human person, which is really sort of at the core of, as I mentioned earlier, of Catholic social doctrine, and then to go perhaps a little more explicitly and with some illustrations through some of the core principles. And so here, I know this is kind of, philosophy on Saturday morning is not exactly what you're expecting, but I think it's really important to a little digression into big philosophical systems. I mean, again, people talk all about polarization and at the level of politics or sports or what have you. But I mean, the big polarization, what are the historically philosophical roots of all of this? I think it's important to at least talk about that very briefly. And his idea, put yourself in the shoes of someone who does not believe in God. Now what? How do we go about it? And of course, this was John Locke, this was Hobbes, this was Rousseau, this was in particular Auguste Comte. So Auguste Comte is probably the founder of modern sociology, but it's essentially, I think, the founder of, as we know nowadays, of positivism and humanism. So the idea that let's try and do something that allows us to work together in a world where there's no transcendent reality. And that's the birth of secular humanism. And really, the big battle is not so much right and left, in my opinion. It's not so much more progressive, less progressive. It really, at the end of the day, is do you have a worldview that's based on accepting the transcendent, accepting the divine, or one that does not, and it's purely secular humanist? That really is the division. Does this relate to Catholic social doctrine? I think it's important to know this because we'll be talking to these people. Sometimes we'll talk about the same thing. Sometimes we talk about completely different things and not knowing that we're talking about completely different things. So morality, ethics. Of course, for a secular humanist, it's purely man-made, okay? as long as you don't interfere with others. It's all about this, living together without interfering with others. And ultimately, this is all about libertarianism, respecting the rights of others. There is no objective morality. Morality is just a system of principles that we agree on. They may be evolutionary, or maybe they were agreed upon at a conference, at a meeting, that are not very important, but it's stuff that allows us to be happy. So that's secular humanism in one paragraph for you when it comes to morality. By contrast, we believe, and Christians believe, that God created the universe and created moral law. That's part of creation. It's not something, some things are good because they're good, not because we decided that they're good. It's not a creation by man. And human happiness for us is union with God, ultimately for eternity, of course, and trying to learn what those laws are. Not to make them, to learn them. Okay? And one person can help others by trying to teach them. By the way, I sort of shamelessly copying from some of the notes that David Gallagher wrote years ago on humanism and the Christian worldview contrasted. Now, historically, there are many people that contribute to this. I mean, Kant has to be talked about in here, because he's sort of the idea, let's create a system of ethics and morality that's practical and can be separated from the transcendent. So that's very much along the same ballpark. You find that a lot. So the Kantianism, the influence of Kant is all over bioethics in the US. It's important to regulate bioethics, of course. They'll tell you, in vitro fertilization and gene editing and selecting fetus, we have to regulate that. We have to have a code of ethics, a professional code of ethics. We're professionals after all. That's the deontological approach to ethics. It's very Kantian. Its philosophical roots are right there in Kant. It's all about a practical rationality. And so this has a lot of overlap with Christian ethics, but I mean, it's very different in its root. One is let's create a system. The other one, let's learn what the real system is. Let's learn what the real laws are. Chris, as you know. But anyway, this is what it is. I'm just telling you this. This is what we're fighting against, or working with. Let's not just say fight against. It's what we're working with. At the level, in particular, I think particularly important, and here I'm putting Jeremy Bentham, who's probably the most influential philosopher for economics. So the world is run by economics largely as well. And people talk about science and technology, but social science has been hugely important in influencing in the world. And in a way, it dates back, goes back to Bentham. Because again, if you're completely devoid of a transcendental reference, then consequentialism makes a ton of sense. It just makes a ton of sense. A thing is good if it produces good results. You talk to most people, say, duh. And for a lot of people, they don't even think twice. And it seems so natural. It seems so obvious, almost. And this goes back to Bentham. So Bentham put it in a much more drastic way. Things that give you pleasure are good, things that don't give you pleasure are bad. And that's how you should. Then people distill that because it was perhaps a little too drastic. Yeah. The fact is that in 99% of the cases, it actually works just fine. And it's actually a good principle of life. In fact, you apply that almost every day. In a sense, you decide A or B because of its consequences. Should I take the train or should I drive? Why? Because in most cases, the moral dimension of the action, the intrinsic value, moral value of the act, it's so small that you just go by consequence. So consequentially worked well. My analogy is classical mechanics, Newtonian mechanics, works just fine for almost everything in daily life. You want to build a bridge, you want to get a car that works, F equals ma, it's the truth. It's not. If you start going into quantum physics, for example, classical mechanics just kind of crashes completely. It's totally useless. So likewise, consequentialism is sort of like classical mechanics. It actually works reasonably well. The point is, when you start getting into the limits of the model into actions that are intrinsically evil or not, then the system completely breaks down, like classical mechanics studying subatomic particles. And that's, again, why it's so difficult, because you're talking to someone about this, and you have to explain to them that consequentialism is not a good way of doing things. It's kind of hard, because in 95% of the cases, it is a good way of doing things. Continue to talk about secular humanism. Sorry, this is a little long, but I think it's important so that we kind of fix ideas. When it comes to progress, so the secular humanist view, and I mean, Steven Pinker might be one of the horsemen of the block. I don't know what you want to call them, but it's a current exponent of that. It's the idea, and we talk about progressives. So when people talk about progressives, they really mean secular humanists in favor of progress, because I'm in favor of progress too. I don't know about you, but I'm in favor of progress myself. I'm not a progressive in the sense that is used the term nowadays. And that distinction has a lot to do with this slide. What do you mean by progress? For a secular humanist, it's just improving, I would say, the material condition that we have, in particular when it comes to medicine and health. So progressives are very, very focused on that as we're the only important thing. Very important thing, of course, but not the only important. And moral progress is the result of, like John Dewey is very important here, the result of a better education system, and science and technology. Trust science is very much a progressive idea, because if you don't have a transcendent, it's all you have is and I trust science too, just not in the same way that a progressive will do. And I don't trust scientists, which is a different thing, by the way. So for a Catholic, the way we think about progress is we have all of these God-given talents, and we have to, use those talents. And that's where science and technology and medicine and so forth come through. And that's not becoming like gods. That's basically making sure that all these talents we have are put to good use. And we're going to do that with the help of God. Okay, we don't fall into Pelagianism. Now I have the technology that I don't need God, finally. Right? Which is Pope Francis has been insisting it's probably the biggest heresy of the century. It's not Arianism, it's not whatever, it's Pelagianism. So we have to do that. And also moral progress or regress is primarily determined by how faithful we are to God's law. Not to how much we've expanded public schooling across the country or across the world. As important as education is, mind. Okay, so again, slight nuances. We are both in favor of progress, but we mean different things and in a different context. So that's kind of secular, and it's going to be very important in the context of Catholic social doctrine. How we're going to evaluate different things. Finally, government. So this is a big one as well, and again, a subtle and with nuances. So for a secular humanist, and in here, I think I would say John Locke is probably historically the important reference. This is long before Auguste Comte. So we're talking about the 17th century. And again, put yourself in the shoes of someone who does not believe in God or does not believe in God. And how can we do this? I mean, we have to live in a society. How are we going to do this? And so that's the whole idea that it's Locke and Hobbes and then Rousseau, which is basically government is a compromise. Listen, if there's no government, if there are no laws, if there's no institutions, if there's no morals, if there's no ethics, this is going to be total chaos. And therefore, we're going to have to keep things under control. So let's try to organize ourselves. It's a bit like there, pick up a football game and you have to, make teams, you have to self-organize in some ways. And that's kind of the secular humanist view of government is basically a set of institutions to protect citizens from each other, because otherwise it will be total chaos. And all of these institutions are man-made and they are created. So secular humanism, probably its most central tenet is the principle of autonomy, which is not the same thing as freedom. So freedom is very much part of our dignity as humans. That's not the same thing as autonomy. It's not easy to explain that, but that's part of the problem. So that's a secular humanism. And I mean, we don't have a lot of time, but again, I think it's important because we have to talk to people like that every day. That's the world we live in. And I think it's important to try to at least get to the common ground. The truth of the matter is that there's a lot of common ground. So exhibit A of that common ground, in my opinion, is human rights. Now, very interesting thing, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of course, you may have your opinions about UN and about everything and all sorts of bad things that it does, but all things considered, you know, maybe it's done, in my opinion, it's done more good than bad. And in particular, the Universal Declaration was a compromise. If you look, Eleanor Roosevelt, I didn't know that until it was a chair of the committee that oversaw the drafting of the Universal Declaration, and it was a weird cast of characters. Had a Chinese Confucianist, had a Greek Orthodox, Lebanese, had a bunch of different people with Eleanor Roosevelt chairing the committee, and in her memoirs, she talks about, you know, all the debate that there was between, you know, there's this guy was quoting Aquinas, you know, Dr. Malik. I was trying to find whether he's a relation to Terrence Malick. Apparently not. Well, they're both from Lebanon, so it's clearly a Lebanese name, not related to the movie director. But he was, of course, quoting Aquinas, saying there is one truth, you know, there's truth and the Chinese delegate, you know, there are many ultimate realities, whatever that means. And there was a back and forth about how, but eventually, at least, you know, they got to a declaration which, you know, I think it's better than nothing. In an article first, which I think it's quite interesting for reasons that I'll explain in the next slide. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It's great that, you know, you're a sexual humanist, I'm a Christian, but at least let's agree on this. It's, you know, it's one step in the right direction. You agree for a completely different reason than I do. You agree with it because you know that if this is not the case, it's total chaos. It's going to be the law of the strongest, and we want to avoid chaos, as per John Locke. So, you know, let's find a common ground. Let's find a common ground. Why is this important? You know, we said, oh, that's just a UN declaration, but here's an example of two systems colliding. And by the way, I don't know, Chris, you of all people should know this. I think that Peter Singer has made an enormous service to the pro-life cause for the wrong reasons. I mean, but he made an enormous service. Why? He's still at prison. So for Peter Singer, who's one of the exponents of secular humanism and of consequentialism, abortion and infanticide have the same moral value, which I agree. I disagree on what that moral value is, but I think, I mean, I take my hat off to Singer for being coherent, at least trying to be coherent, being honest about it, and taking things to its consequences, logical consequences. At least he's logical about it. And so he's on record saying that killing a defective infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. He's making this distinction between human being and person. Interesting, right? I don't know if you noticed that in a recent interview that Pope Francis gave to American Magazine, he says that, you know, abortion is always wrong because always killing a human being. And we know it's a human being. Biology tells us this is a human being and all the indicators, the heartbeat and all of that. I'm not going to say whether it's a person because that's a complicated philosophical concept and there's debate about that. But let's go back to the Universal Declaration. Does it talk that every person has equal dignity? No. Every human being. So this is kind of interesting. Secular humanists co-wrote the Universal Declaration and they agreed in the language human being. I think that we should get some leverage out of that. Because then discussion is it a human being or not? Not about human person. Is it a human being or not? Anyway, I thought it's good. Okay, continue with human person. Again, against consequential and utilitarianism, this goes back, created by God and will by God, will by God. Two things that I'm going to mention this related to the person, family and work. So these are two important implications that are derived from the centrality of the person in Catholic social thought. So from Centesimus Annus, it's one of many quotes that I could have used about the family. And speaking of that, I thought I would do sort of a quick digression. This goes back to something that I was mentioning earlier. Fortunately, there is a lot of good academic research. We're talking about the past 20 years. It's something very recent that is giving us a lot of very good ammunition to talk about issues like family and work and Catholic social doctrine without necessarily having to call it Catholic. And this is a brief digression. You may remember the 1994 book, The Bell Curve, which was extremely controversial. It's all about IQ at age 3, how there are big differences across socioeconomic and racial strata, and how it's all genetic. Well, and how therefore Herrnstein and Murray in particular, who's one of the most canceled authors in the past few years, how they're really basically racist. And if you read carefully the book, first of all, in chapter 13, they said that debate about whether and how much genes and environment have to do with ethnic differences remains unresolved. So, but nobody ever gets to chapter 13 in the book. So they just take the results that they say and say, you're racist. But here's the most interesting thing. So, and there's the reason why I'm bringing that up right now. There's a 2013 article in the American Economic Review, which is the premier scholarly journal in economics. And economists has really gotten into this, interested in this. And we now have very good longitudinal studies that started 8 months old. And you may ask, how on earth can you measure intelligence? Well, actually, it turns out you can. You do a series of tests to see how children react to stimuli, how their eyes move and stuff like that. Don't ask me the technicalities because I really don't know, but they have a fairly good way of measuring that. And to summarize hundreds and hundreds of pages into a 30-second statement, at 8 months, there's already a significant variation in IQ as well as you can measure, but the differences across socioeconomic strata or races are zero. Statistically insignificant. So the big question that people are researching right now, whatever is happening between 8 months and 3 years old, because at 3, there are already big differences according to socioeconomic status. Whatever is happening between 8 months and 3 years. That's probably the biggest question that brings together psychologists, sociologists, and economists. And again, I'm kind of summarizing this because this is not part of the course, but I think it's useful to show the kind of modern science that I think is being used to bring back the importance of the family. What's happening? Two things. We know that one of the best predictors of IQ is the vocabulary of a 3-year-old, the vocabulary that a 3-year-old was exposed to in terms of number of words and number of different words and frequency with which they hear the different words. That's fact number 1. Very well established. Fact number 2, huge correlation between socioeconomic strata of the parents and number of words that a child hears. You see here in the chart, number of utterances per hour and number of different words per hour. Big differences. This is where the differences are taking place between 8 months and 3 years old. Even before a child can speak, they're already listening to words, and it makes a huge difference. Yes?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to then overlap this with, both two-parent household and single-parent household.
No, I'm going to do that. Yeah, that's my next slide. So if you've ever been in the New York subway, you know exactly what it's disheartening because you see a single mother and all they say to the kids is, yes, no, shut up, no, shut up. It's one word answers. And you have to feel for her because, I mean, she's going from the second to the third job. Tired, no time. just doesn't have the time, the patience, whatnot. It's not, by the way, this is not that higher socioeconomic strata, they have a richer vocabulary. No, we're talking about very simple words. It's not about how many words the mother knows. That's not the issue. It's really about time, attention, ability, and knowledge, by the way. Once they go back to talk to the mothers about the results of these studies, they said that they break down crying because they had no idea. They also had no idea this was important. Whereas higher socioeconomic strata mothers, they're all reading the books and you're going online and checking everything ad nauseam. And this is what's happening between 8 months and 3 years old. Very little to do with genes, very little to do with even the education of the parents through this indirect work, that you're less educated, you're more likely to be a single mother, you're more likely to have 3 jobs. That's really what's going on. Like I said, is that some kids in poor families, in particular in single mother families, they're not given enough attention. They're not spoken to. By the way, I'm summarizing here. It's not just the number of words. It's also complete sentences. It's also about giving simple, logical reasoning when they can already say, not just say, no, don't do that because. It's words of encouragement, hugely important. This is not just logical, it's also emotional. Oh, this is now very well studied because we have very good longitudinal studies with both interviews. So it's a combination of all of that. This takes time. And Jim Heckman, Nobel laureate, has been hugely influential in this. And he does studies where he starts going back at pilot programs that were done in the 1960s. Kids were kind of almost my age. And he follows them to now when they're in their 50s. You still notice the difference between those who had those pilot programs and those who did not. And the programs are typically getting parents involved. It's incredible how 50 years later, having had a 1-year program with parents in some neighborhood of Detroit, is still showing in terms of all the measurables, how much they earn, are they married, a stable marriage, and their kids, even their kids, that it ripples down into the next generation. Raj Chetty, professor of economics at Harvard University, very influential in this moving neighborhoods effect. And he has this result that the New York Times, that guy was writing in the New York Times, you even have to preface it by saying, what I'm going to write next may sound conservative to you. So he had to apologize for it. And what he was saying is that the data shows that the percentage of families, of 2-parent families in a neighborhood is hugely influential in the upbringing of children under 10 years old, which, if I tell you that, you say, duh. We've been saying duh for 30 years, but the moment you have, it's not just that he's a Harvard professor, it's that he somehow convinced the Census Bureau to let him look at individual census data, which in principle should be almost unconstitutional, I know, but he got it anonymized. That means that he's not sampling, it doesn't have a sample of people in the US, it has America, everybody. And then he's tracing all the movements and very good statistical compelling case for causation that moving to this better neighborhood, and by better neighborhood, what it means, among other things, is the percentage of 2-parent families is a huge factor of success for raising children. Yep. So in answer to your question, one of the, to summarize a lot of this research is the so-called the Heckman equation. Anyway, so here's the idea, it's showing that, listen, we all know that post-school age job training is a very good investment. We have a lot of estimates for this. We have estimates for the college premium, having a college degree on average has a return on investment of about 10 to 15%, which is a huge number. But his point is, and he puts numbers into that. I can give you studies that put numbers into that. The earlier the age is, the higher the return on investment, all the way to prenatal, by the way. What are we going to do? Just going to talk about work and then probably very briefly about principles, including subsidiarity, because we have to finish at 1. the idea of subjective value of work, just for a little bit of a sort of amusing digression in here. I don't know if you remember, very nostalgic about one of these 70s sitcoms, Mary Tyler Moore show. Anyway, in the first episode, she's hired at a TV station, and she's hired for a secretarial job, of course. But then the producer, that's Lou Grant, Edner, he says that, you know, I can, if you accept $10 less, I can give you a job of associate producer. Oh, associate producer, kind of like that kind of thing. And he sees that she had a positive reaction to that. Well, if you can live with minus $15, I'll make you a producer. And I think this is a great answer. Now, all I can afford is to be associate professor right now. But what's the point? I mean, of course, work and the job, it's not just the money. There's so many things. There's the subjective element of it. There's also the status. I mean, it's part of human dignity to have a job. That's why I think it's so much more important for people to have a job than to get an income from the government. Even if the money-wise, it's the same thing. It's the same thing money-wise, but it's not the same thing because we all have a vocation to work. And that's one of the things that Laborum Exercens, the 1981 encyclical, is so important, that really nailed it on the head. And the Pope, with its personalist training, philosophical training, really, I think, did it so well. And that's very much a central point. Initially, Catholic social doctrine started precisely because of the labor problem, because, I mean, this is a picture of a factory in England during the Industrial Revolution. I mean, they had these kids working for 10 hours, 11 hours, 12 hours, 13 hours, 14 hours in subhuman conditions. And this was unbridled capitalism. That's really what it was. And so Leo XIII, I mean, that's the church saying that's not Christian. This is not Christian. But they're not forced to work in there. Well, that's not the point. In a way, they are forced to work in there. They have no alternative. They have no food. They have to make them. And so that's certainly one important element in Catholic social doctrine. But it's more than that. It's more than that. And I think it's going to be a big one. And we already had this discussion earlier. I mean, the digital revolution is truly creating an adjustment problem. It's not that it's going to create an employment, but it's likely going to create a lot of jobs that are not very good jobs. And that's going to be an issue. And John Paul II talked about structures of sin in society. I think that the digital revolution has in it a structural inequality. And we see that a lot. And one of my favorite examples is I've been doing some work on superstars. And I mean, just to put things into numbers for you to understand what I'm talking about, take actors. So Humphrey Bogart was a leading actor in the 1950s, and that's already after the breakup of the studio system. So he's a free agent. Tom Cruise is a leading actor nowadays. If you do the math, and I did the math, if you try to bring Humphrey Bogart's wage into the present, which is inflation, not just inflation, also the industry has grown in size. Now it's not just the box office, it's also streaming, and there's all sorts of revenue sources. If you do all of that, you find two things. First, actors in general, they still make more or less what they made back in the 50s, proportion-wise, in proportion of the value of the pie. But the top actors, huge difference. So Bogart, for a movie, for his best movie, which was Sabrina, money-wise, not his best movie in terms artistically, but in terms of salary, it was Sabrina. That would correspond to about $5 million in today's money. Now, $5 million gets you to have breakfast with Tom Cruise to talk about how much he's going to make in the next movie. I exaggerate a little bit, but I mean, Tom Cruise probably makes 50 at least. Harrison Ford has made more than 100 in some movies. It's just at least one extra zero. It's at least 1 order of magnitude. So there's something going, this is called the superstar effect. Because of globalization and the digital revolution, the top talent, people who are really at the top of the ladder, they're growing disproportionately in earnings with respect to the rest. And it can have many pairs, you know, Grisham in the 90s and J.K. Rowling in the 2000s. How many copies did J.K. Grisham sell in the 90s? You know, like The Firm, Pelican Brief, you know, and all those 50 million copies. 50 million copies. That's a lot. How many did J.K. Rowling sell in the first decade of the 21st century? 500 million. It's one extra zero. Just, I mean, it's you see that Madonna or U2 in one concert, even correcting for inflation, they make more money than the Beatles in their entire US tour in the 1960s. It's just completely disproportionate. Athletes like Ronaldo and Pelé, or Jack Welch and Alfred Sloan, perhaps one of the greatest references in management in America, or Frank Gehry, the architect, and Le Corbusier. Make these comparisons. It's not that architects are making more money. It's that Gehry, with respect to the average architect, is making a ton more than Le Corbusier was making with respect to the average architect. So the nature of globalization and the economic transformation of this century, naturally, as it were, tends to really skew the distribution of earnings on the right tail, to speak statistically. And so, and at the opposite end, the opposite happens. I mean, I know this is not a very popular thing to present in front of executives, but this, I think it's really incredible. So here's the average salary in US firms. It's going up, but it's going up very slowly. So that's this scale in here. I think it's dollars per week. Dollars, correcting for inflation, I think it's $2,000. I forget exactly what it is. Line in red is the ratio of CEO pay at Fortune 500 divided by the workers who work at the Fortune 500 companies. It's an index. It's about 20 in 1980. It's now about 300. Now, I might say that part of that is that the firms that the S&P 500 are managing are worth a lot more, and therefore they have greater responsibilities, as it were. But so Catholic social doctrine does not put a number. You know, what is the number? What is the ratio of earnings of a CEO to a worker that's ethical? I don't know. I don't have a number. I can tell you in Europe, it's between 15 and 20. One might make the argument that 300 is, it's higher than 20. Let's just leave it at that. In defense of CEOs in America, it's highly risky. It's highly variable. I mean, these guys are subjected to huge fluctuations, especially when they have, contingent pay. So I will grant you that. Still, 300 is a very high number, very high ratio. This is the world we live in, and so this is, I think, it's a big challenge for Catholic social doctrine. I really think we're going to need a new model of solidarity to address that. This is not Catholic social doctrine. This is my own opinion. This is one of the crusades that I and other people have been fighting. I think that we should terminate labor taxation, period, and as a first step, make a reform whereby that's more or less neutral from a firm's point of view between taxing profits and taxing labor, so that your average corporation continues to pay the same amount of taxes, but pays labor pays zero taxes, in my opinion. Because right now, if you want to give a worker $1,000, you have to spend close to $2,000, and of course, that's the reason that we then invest in robots and whatever to replace that labor. It's expensive. Low-skilled labor is expensive in America right now, largely because you have to pay health insurance, Social Security, series of unemployment insurance. That would be my suggestion for that. Anyway, but that's just a very quick digression. So family and work are two important elements, two important dimensions that follow from the human centrality that society and work should have. And with that, we finish the second of 3 points. And I don't know what to do now.